Thanks, Denise. I want to thank everybody who's been so nice to me here at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Center. I've gotten to have a tour and seen the Benito Juarez exhibit, which I encourage all of you to go see when there isn't some very big event going on over there like there is right now. It's a fantastic show, and really the relationship between Juarez and Lincoln is so really intriguing. What I want to talk to you guys about today is my most recent book, A Wicked War, Polk, Clay, Lincoln, and the 1846 U.S. invasion of Mexico. The title, A Wicked War, is taken from a quote from Ulysses S. Grant. From late in his life, Grant looked back sort of on everything that he'd done in his career, and in his memoirs he writes very frankly about the experiences that he's had, the good and the bad, and it makes for really good reading. But one thing that Grant spent some time thinking and talking about late in his life was his role in the U.S.-Mexico War of 1846. And Grant said, at that time, I do not think there was ever a more wicked war than that waged by the United States on Mexico. I thought so at the time when I was a youngster, only I had not moral courage enough to resign. And Grant, of course, during the time of the U.S.-Mexico War was a young lieutenant. And I just found this a really moving quote, and that's why I took it for my title. Because the fact of the matter is that Grant was not alone in thinking that the U.S. invasion of Mexico was somehow wicked. One thing that I talk about in this book, and I'm going to talk about tonight, is the evolution of the American public during the course of the U.S.-Mexico War, which was not a long war by any means, from being really enthusiastic and in favor of invading Mexico to largely turning against the war. And I see the U.S.-Mexico War as the moment of America's first anti-war movement actually coming into being. So there was anti-war sentiment during the Revolution and certainly during the War of 1812, but that sentiment was limited. What you see happen in 1847 is a consensus really across the board, people from different regions of the country, soldiers in the field, officers, politicians, all deciding that a war that was being more or less successfully waged in another country was wrong and actually protesting that war. So I think this is a really interesting moment in American history, and it takes place in a war that people really don't know much about. The U.S.-Mexico War, people don't write about it a lot. It doesn't have a big place in sort of the historical imagination of Americans, and there's a number of reasons for that. It's often confused with the Texas Revolution that happened 8 years before, or ignored altogether. When historians do talk about the U.S.-Mexico War, they tend to think about the war in relationship to the Civil War. And they narrate the U.S.-Mexico War as sort of the first stop on the road to secession, arguing that the land that came from Mexico at the close of the war was what really caused sectionalism to heat up. And in fact, all that's true. So you can definitely look at the war as sort of the moment that the Civil War became inevitable, if you want to look at it that way. Or you can look at it on its own terms, which is what I try to do in this book. What I really was interested in doing when I wrote this book was to show the impact of the war on individuals and on families. The U.S.-Mexico War had the highest mortality rate of any American war. 15% of soldiers who served in Mexico for the United States died. 78,000 troops served in Mexico, and it was a war that had a big impact on people at home. So I really wanted to write a narrative that explored how people in the United States and also in Mexico, how the war impacted them and their families. And some of the people that I talk about in this war are Abraham Lincoln, who makes his first major political speech, a speech that I found actually was quite widely documented and discussed in newspapers. His first major speech in Congress is about the U.S.-Mexico War. It's condemning the war. So Lincoln's first political stance on the national stage is actually against the U.S.-Mexico War. That's one person that I talk about. Another person I talk about is John J. Hardin, who some of you may be familiar with. He was a part of a very, very important family in Jacksonville. And for a period of time, he was the leading Whig politician in the state of Illinois, not Abraham Lincoln. And it's only Hardin's death in the U.S.-Mexico War that some people have argued makes Lincoln's path forward and his road to the presidency possible, because he was really under the shadow of John Hardin before that happened. Hardin's family is really fascinating, and they're deeply, deeply affected by the U.S.-Mexico War. Now let me tell you a little bit about the war, because I'm assuming that, like most people, you probably don't know a whole lot about it. The North American invasion, as it was known in Mexico, began when President James K. Polk sent troops into a disputed area between the Nueces and the Rio Grande rivers with the intention of starting a war. Polk wanted war. He was set on declaring war if the Mexican army didn't rise to the bait. In fact, the day before he found out that Mexicans had crossed the Rio Grande and killed 14 soldiers in this disputed area, Polk actually went to his cabinet and he said, I think we should declare war against Mexico. And his cabinet said, well, we really can't declare war against Mexico because the Mexicans haven't done anything. We've sent 4,000 American troops down into land that Mexico thinks is theirs, and we're waiting for something to happen, and it hasn't happened, so we can't declare war on Mexico yet. But then Polk finds out the next day that, in fact, an incident had happened 2 weeks before. Of course, news traveled very slowly then. And when Polk got this incident that he needed, he went to Congress on May 11th, 1846, and he stated, Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory, and shed American blood on American soil. Now, not to put too fine a point on it, this was a lie, and everybody knew it was a lie. The Whig Party, which was the opposition party, Abraham Lincoln's party, everybody in the Whig Party in Congress knew that, in fact, the land where the soldiers had been sent, where the army was currently occupying, had always been considered Mexican rather than Texan land. And a lot of congressmen, both Whigs and Democrats, write privately to each other after Polk makes this statement, well, the idea that this is American soil that blood's been shed on is pretty dubious, but the fact of the matter is, everybody lines up and they vote in favor of Polk's declaration of war. You can't really call it a declaration of war because Polk isn't asking Congress to declare war. He's saying a war is already going on. Let's send support to the troops. So the Whigs are afraid of looking unpatriotic, of suffering under the label of not being patriotic. So all but 14 members of Congress vote in favor of declaring war against Mexico, and that's how the war starts. And the Mexican War is short. It's 20 months total, and only about 16 months of those are actual fighting. But as you're going to hear today, the war was not short enough for the American people. It was marked by a number of stunning military successes by the United States, such as the Battle of Buena Vista, where 5,000 U.S. soldiers defeated an army under General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna of between 15 and 20,000 soldiers. Now, the numbers, the ratio in the Battle of Buena Vista is obviously quite astounding. But the fact of the matter is that in almost every battle of the U.S.-Mexico War, Mexican troops greatly outnumbered U.S. troops, and yet the U.S. won every single military engagement in this war, with the exception of the Battle of San Pasqual in California, which Americans prefer to sort of think of as a skirmish rather than a battle. So that doesn't really count. Other than that, Americans win every single battle. There were 3 theaters of the war. In the first stage of the war, General Zachary Taylor secured northern Mexico with key victories, including this one at Buena Vista in 1846 and the first months of 1847. The second theater of war, General Stephen Watts Kearny travels west from Fort Leavenworth in Kansas through New Mexico, conquering New Mexico, and all the way to California, and that happens about the same time. Now, unfortunately, neither of these tremendous victories bring what Polk wants, which is peace and the securing of California and Texas into the American Union. Mexico refuses to surrender despite the victories of both Taylor and Kearny. So Polk decides to send General Winfield Scott to invade central Mexico. He bombards Veracruz and travels through central Mexico, securing the capital in the fall of 1847. Now, in the eyes of Americans, it was sort of a foregone conclusion that their side would win, and win easily because most U.S. citizens harbored a host of racist beliefs about Mexican men, foremost among them being that Mexican men were too lazy and cowardly to fight. Now, in point of fact, Mexican troops fought very hard, as you can see in this really rare print, Mexican print of the war. Mexico produced very, very few images of the war, so it's great when you find one so you can actually get a sense of how they're envisioning what's happening. Mexico lost all of these battles and ultimately lost the military side of the war because they had vastly inferior weapons. Their leadership was terrible. Mexico's government was in turmoil. They were broke. There were various battles where there actually no money was even making it